Welcome to Visionary, How William Blake Changed the World, a series of podcasts that explore the life, work and reception of the romantic artist and poet, William Blake. I'm Jason Whitaker, a writer and academic who has been exploring the significance of Blake's work for more than 30 years. In this episode, I'm going to be looking at the influence of Blake on two science fiction authors, Angela Carter and J.G. Ballard. Ballard, who was born in Shanghai, China in 1930, lived from 1960 until his death in 2009 in the family home in Shepperton, London. Associated with the 1960s new wave of science fiction, and best known for his controversial novel Crash, as well as his memoir Empire of the Sun, the latter detailing his childhood experiences in a prisoner of war camp, Ballard was greatly influenced by the pop art movement and also by surrealism, the latter of which was one of his sources for an interest in William Blake. Ballard's The Unlimited Dream Company is a non-Christian retelling of Blake's Milton, a poem, an attempt to rewrite Blake using Freud, Jung and surrealism. The central character, simply named as Blake, is, we learn, experiencing the final moments of a dying fantasy as he drowns in the Cessna airplane he has stolen and crash-landed in the Thames, near to the suburb of Shepperton. In the dream world of this suburb, Blake has extraordinary powers. He can fly, heal sick people, and absorb others whenever he likes. But he cannot escape Shepperton despite his repeated attempts. While there, he encounters a number of characters, including Miriam St. Cloud and Stark, the latter a loner like Blake who runs a semi-derelict zoo and who shoots Blake before he can absorb everyone in Shepperton to gain enough energy to fly away from the suburbs. From this time on, Blake begins instead to help others, to help them escape rather than himself, and the novel ends with him confronting the skeleton of the dead pilot who haunts the crashed Cessna. In Milton, a poem, the two central characters are Milton and Loss, William Blake's figure of the poet and prophet who, increasingly in his later works, serves as a representation of the artist himself. Loss is a representation of Blake's vision of the Christian ideal, renouncing the political violence through which the historical John Milton sometimes sought to uphold the Republic. In The Unlimited Dream Company, by contrast, the character Blake is more like Orc than Loss, a hypersexualized and violent rapist who portrays the spirit of Orc in the worst possible way, drawing on the hints of that figure of rebellion as depicted in the preludium to America, A Prophecy. In the pre-Shepperton world, Blake is derelict and dangerous. His powers, however, are restricted. In the life and death he experiences in Shepperton, by contrast, those powers become almost unlimited, bound only by the strange horizon of the suburb itself. Throughout the novel, there are many parallels to Max Ernst and other surrealists, as well as William Blake, this being a feature of Ballard's writing since at least his 1962 novel, The Drowned World. Thus the character Blake's assumption of a bird-like body is akin to the Ernst bird avatar, Lop Lop, while the description of Shepperton as an Amazonian town is like the grattage cities of the forest scraped by Ernst on canvas in the 1920s. Likewise, the depiction of Miriam in her wedding dress draws upon the painting The Robing of the Bride from 1940, especially in chapter 31, where she is dressed for a particularly appalling ritual, in which, after a dismal orgy among the people of Shepperton, she is raped to death by Blake. The Unlimited Dream Company does not hold back on the vicious and degrading fantasies of a dying Blake, and so deals with a particular state of psychosis. When we are introduced to this character, Blake is a failure in everything: mercenary pilot, Jesuit priest, writer of pornography, who, after the attempted murder of his fiancée, steals a Cessna and crash lands near Shepperton Studios. This becomes the Felpham of the novel, England's green and pleasant land transferred to the suburbs. But rather than William Blake struggling to recuperate a Eurysenic Milton who had excluded sexuality from his vision of heaven, Ballard is competing with a demonic, orc-like Blake who, in his invocations to travel to the Palace of Wisdom via the road of excess, opens the door to a very worst damaged psychoses of post-60s liberation. As he crashes, he has an apocalyptic vision of the end of the world. What we will realise is his own end. But instead he returns to life, surrounded by those characters, Miriam, Wingate, Mrs. St. Cloud, Stark, who operate as types from his unconscious rather than rounded characters. Slowly he discovers that he is trapped in Shepperton, and, as a truly dangerous and priapic rapist, seeks the engine by which to flee the town.
I needed to go further. To undermine the trust between wives and husbands. Between fathers and sons. I wanted them to cross the lines that divided children and parents. Species and biological kingdoms. The animate and inanimate. I wanted to destroy the restraints that separated mother and son, father and daughter.
His response to rapes and attempted murder are chilling. These crimes and lusts were the first stirrings of the benign forces revealed to me in Shepperton. There is a kind of wonder to Blake's projections within the suburb. In his dreams of being a bird, the other occupants become birds who he gradually absorbs into his body, and the town is transformed by lurid tropical vegetation. In this world, he becomes as a god, and in the chapter The Life Engine, the inhabitants of Shepperton, now naked, build shrines to Blake as a pagan deity. In this respect, perhaps, he is like Satan or even Urizen, a counterfeit god. The nakedness of the town's citizens implies that they have returned to Eden, but this Eden is itself false, the implication of its falsehood being given strength by the fact that only Blake can see that all these people are naked. In other words, it is another psychotic projection on his part. This theme of divinity is repeated throughout the later part of the novel, as in the chapter The Motorcade, where he describes himself as a god reborn from the dead, and the first living creature to escape death, to rise above mortality to become a god. Blake sees himself as a single chimeric god uniting all life within me. In terms that William Blake would have recognised, the Blake of the Unlimited Dream Company has become Satan, one god, one priest, one king, because he wants to consume everything to escape Shepperton, transformed in the novel into a surrealist hell, and preserve his own life in the process. It is, however, Miriam's death that begins his return to life. He has sacrificed Olalon. Blake's answer to every difficulty has been to consume more, via rape, murder, even a kind of cannibalistic absorption. His conception of his own body, transferring the spaces of Shepperton to his body as William Blake described London and Britain mapped onto Albion, is extremely Blakean, though in this case it is the small suburbs of my body. One passage, however, demonstrates just how far the indebtedness to William Blake goes.
The townspeople of Shepperton were hiding in their bedrooms, but at dusk a party of women approached the memorial and began to abuse me. They were mothers of the children I had taken into me. Those girls and boys whose distant souls ran through the dark galleries deep within me, and alone kept me alive.
This description as a dark pastoral is reminiscent of those other pastorals of songs of innocence and of experience, but also of a moment in Milton the poem when loss stands within Satan. I also stood in Satan's bosom and beheld its desolations. A ruined man, a ruined building of God not made with hands, its plains of burning sand, its mountains of marble terrible, its pits and declivities flowing with molten ore and fountains of pitch and nitre, its ruined palaces and cities and mighty works, its furnaces of affliction in which his angels and emanations labour with blackened visages among its stupendous ruins, arches and pyramids and porches, colonnades and domes, in which dwells mystery Babylon. Here is her secret place, from hence she comes forth on the churches in delight. Here is her cup filled with its poison in these horrid veils, and here her scarlet veil woven in pestilence and war. Here is Jerusalem bound in chains in the dens of Babylon. The Blake of the Unlimited Dream Company is clearly identified here as Satan. After the death of Miriam, there is no mistaking that Shepperton now has become hell. Instead of the beautiful ambiguity of Max Ernst's jungle forest and the flight of glorious if threatening birds, other characters such as Stark try to use Blake to escape the suburbs, turning to a slaughter of every animal they can find when that is unsuccessful. In such circumstances, flies transfer from Blake's body onto the corpses, transforming him into a Beelzebub, and doubtless an allusion to Golding's Lord of the Flies. Soon afterwards, even the last of the birds are killed, and Blake describes Shepperton as a garden of cancers. It is at this moment that the animals in Stark's zoo give up their life for Blake, an act of self-sacrifice that shows him what he must do. Born again, the father of myself, he gives himself away, dismembering himself to cure everyone in Shepperton, and thus becoming Christ-like. This leads to a final act of revelation, a day of judgment in chapter 39, Departure, where the inhabitants of Shepperton fly away, leaving Blake behind and allowing him to raise Miriam, his Ololon, having confronted his own Satan, the skeleton in the cockpit. That final confrontation where Blake struggles with the skeleton that he finally recognizes to be himself, his drowned body that he has sought to escape, is the same revelation that Milton experiences in Milton a Poem. Satan, my spectre, I know my power thee to annihilate, and be a greater in thy place, and be thy tabernacle, a covering for thee to do thy will, till one greater comes, and smites me as I smote thee, and becomes my covering. Such are the laws of thy false heavens, but laws of eternity are not such. Know thou, I came to self-annihilation. Such are the laws of eternity, that each shall mutually annihilate himself for others' good, as I for thee. Thy purpose, and the purpose of thy priests and of thy churches, is to impress on men the fear of death, to teach trembling and fear, terror, constriction, abject selfishness. Mine is to teach men to despise death, and to go on in fearless majesty, annihilating self, laughing to scorn thy laws and terrors, shaking down thy synagogues as webs. I come to discover before heaven and hell the self-righteousness in all its hypocritic turpitude, opening to every eye these wonders of Satan's holiness, showing to the earth the idle virtues of the natural heart and Satan's seat. Explore in all its selfish natural virtue, and put off in self-annihilation all that is not of God alone. To put off self and all I have, ever and ever. Amen. As William Blake rewrote Milton as a Eurozenic Satan, so Ballard rewrites Blake in the Unlimited Dream Company as an orcish devil, retelling Christian stories for a post-Christian generation that owes more to Freud and Nietzsche, but has not yet reconciled itself to the pagan narratives that still drive its unconscious. The ultimate question of the novel is, what is the role of love in a world without God? Blake is driven by his selfishness throughout the novel, and, like Milton in Blake's original poem, he must give up that selfhood. Alongside J.G. Ballard, another author who's greatly influenced by Blake was Angela Carter. Angela Carter was born in 1940 in Eastbourne, Sussex, and was evacuated during the Second World War before moving to London to complete her schooling, then Bristol, where she went to university. In 1969, she used prize money for her third novel, Several Perceptions, to move to Tokyo, which she later claimed made her a much more radical thinker and writer. After exploring Europe, Asia and the USA, she worked as a novelist, freelance writer and writer-in-residence, contributing regularly to newspapers and also producing a series of influential non-fiction essays, including The Sardian Woman and Nothing Sacred. Her writing contributed greatly to second-wave feminism and after during the 1970s and 80s, exploring common tropes of romantic fiction and, most notably, fairy tales from a feminist perspective. While attracted to Blake's writing, she was also highly critical of his attitudes to gender and sexuality, best epitomised by her 1978 article for the New Statesman, Little Lamb, Get Lost. In this, she was much closer to a number of critics from the time, including Susan Fox and Anne K. Mellor, who were very keen to break down many of the assumptions that had dominated post-war Blake criticism, dominated as it was by male scholars. Carter's most extensive criticism of Blake, however, came not in articles, but in a novel. The Passion of New Eve is set in a near-future dystopian United States where civil war has broken out, and the connections to Blake's work, particularly Milton, a poem, have been noted by a number of scholars. Published after The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman, it continues many of the sadomasochistic themes of that novel, and Carter herself may have been influenced by the conflation of Blake and Dissard in Bataille's Literature and Evil, first translated in 1973. Christopher Ranger has described Blake and Carter as friendly enemies, and her own attitude to him is best summed up by a comment in her introduction to the Farrago book of fairy tales.
When I was a girl, I thought that everything Blake said was holy. But now I am older and have seen more of life, I treat his aphorisms with the affectionate skepticism appropriate to the exhortations of a man who claimed to have seen a fairy's funeral.
The Passion of New Eve may owe as much to Blake's America prophecy as to Milton, a poem, beginning as it does with Locke's epigram, "In the beginning all the world was America." But while she may treat him with skepticism, she was inspired in a critical stance towards Enlightenment thinking by Blake and Dissard. At the beginning of the novel, Evelyn is told the age of reason is over by a Czech soldier guarding the university where he is to work. New York had been built as a city of reason, so its fall will be much worse. Layla, the young woman he encounters, is the dark shadow, most probably a reference to the shadowy female of America, and, as we shall discover by the end of the novel, becomes Lilith to Eve. While she is increasingly sceptical of Blake, Carter takes from the romantic, and indeed from fairy tales as well, the tendency to write in archetypes. Also, again something she shares with Ballard, she is also concerned with the return of repressed desire, invoking images of Rahab the harlot in her discussions of Evelyn's relations with Layla, and reference the proverb of hell, "You never know what is enough unless you know what is more than enough," when Evelyn says of his lover, "I had enough of her, then more than enough." Leaving Layla after making her undergo an abortion that goes horribly wrong and leaves her incapable of bearing other children, Evelyn travels west into the desert, where he is taken to Buer, the place where contrarieties are equally true, and which is described in the novel as follows.
Buer is a profane place. It is a crucible. It is the home of the woman who calls herself the great parricide, also glories in the title of the great emasculator. Ecstasy their only anesthetic, the priest of Cybele sheared off their parts to exalt her, ran bleeding, psalmodizing, through the streets. This woman has many names, but her daughters call her mother.
Buer is where the connection to Milton a poem is made most explicit, as in the following lines from the beginning of Book 2 of William Blake's poem. There is a place where contrarieties are equally true. This place is called Buer. It is a pleasant, lovely shadow where no dispute can come because of those who sleep. Into this place the sons and daughters of Ololon descended with solemn mourning into Beulah's moony shades and hills, weeping for Milton. Mute wonder held the daughters of Beulah, enraptured with affection's sweet and mild benevolence. Beulah is evermore created around eternity, appearing to the inhabitants of Eden around them on all sides. But Beulah to its inhabitants appears within each district as the beloved infant in his mother's bosom, round encircled with arms of love and pity and sweet compassion. But to the sons of Eden, the moony habitations of Beulah are from great eternity a mild and pleasant rest. As with Susan Fox's critique of Blake, it is the inferior stereotype of Beulah compared to Eden which most drives Carter's anger. As a direct refutation of the earlier romantic, she makes Beulah a place of struggle and conflict, not rest. And while it draws a mythic element such as the cult of Cybele, it is also presented in scientific and technological terms, almost Eurozenic as a site of experimentation and operation where Evelyn will be medically transformed into Eve. Carter also plays with other fundamentalist stereotypes employed by Blake, such as his categorization of loss as time and enitharmon as space, when she writes, "Time is a man, space is a woman." Eve becomes a woman who does not understand the space of America where she is repeatedly lost, a man who runs out of time repeatedly. Transformed into a woman and escaping mother, Eve is captured and enslaved by Zero the poet, or Carter's caricature of Lost the prophet, who adored the desert, she writes, because he hated humanity, and once wrote his poetry down, but found it disgusted him. This misogynistic Charles Manson-esque figure may be a wry commentary on the adaptation of Blake by the counterculture and the Beats in particular, an end result of the indulgence of masculinity that is criticised in an incredibly brutal fashion. Zero's rape of Eve is grotesque but also desultory, over in a sentence, and in this respect it is surprisingly close to the description of Uthun's rape by Bromion in Visions of the Daughters of Albion. The 7 women who live with him, and it is clear who are there in the end because they choose to be, he having no power of himself. Along with Eve, they find themselves in a deserted town, ironically described as the New Jerusalem. Zero assumes that he is in control of the cult he has generated, but it becomes clear that without the willing actions of his female followers, he has no power at all. Zero has a bust of Nietzsche on his desk, who notoriously reminded his readers to take a whip when they went to women, and this pseudo-intellectualism is a general comment by Carter on the Romantics as a whole. He is, after all, as much a Byronic as Blakean parody, a comparison that is made explicit a few pages later. Zero is a contrary to Mother that Eve seems to believe will be synthesized in the character that Zero is hunting down, the faded femme fatale film star Tristessa, who turns out not to be a woman at all but a trans artist. The terms used to describe Tristessa when Zero finds her, platonic shadow show, an illusion that could fill my own emptiness with marvellous imaginary things as long as the movie lasted, suggests a negation rather than emanation, although for Carter, both terms probably amount to the same thing. She is, of course, not all that she seems. The ideal woman becomes a projection of male desire, as Tristessa portrays himself as a stereotype of the feminine form. The parody wedding that ends the Bacchanalia in Tristessa's mansion is thus a never-ending series of shifting identities, in which I only mimicked what I had been, I did not become it. An interesting rebuff to Blake's line, "They became what they beheld," often repeated throughout Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. Theirs is a double wedding with both the groom, both the bride. The entire novel, then, is a critique of Blake's notions of sexual identity, zoas, emanations, spectres. Blake is one of the most interesting figures of the 18th century to open up ideas of what sexual identity is, but ultimately remains bound to a male-female duality. The Passion of New Eve ends in civil war in California, the end of the world both in terms of space and time. It's apocalypse. Here Eve finally meets Leela again and discovers that she is the daughter of Mother and her true name is Lilith. Leela's antinomy is not Eve, but Sophia, the divine virgin to her harlot. This in turn offers an interesting insight into the limitations of archetypes used by Carter as much as by Blake. That such archetypes too easily become stereotypes. Those archetypes are invoked here in a Jungian sense in the final scenes, where Eve descends through caves to Mother, in lines which often echo the marriage of heaven and hell, or the Book of Urizen. Eve is reborn a woman in Eden, and not in secondary Beulah.